Fairies have no use for the human constructs of good and evil. They do, however, prize 7 valuable attributes.
If you would like to learn about fairy folklore, delve into modern fairy faith spirituality, and explore fun and fanciful fairy-themed events, please subscribe to Fairy Fortunes for new videos every Friday.
Hello, my fair friends. I'm Ruby Ruse, and this is Fairy Fortunes. Now, in many of my videos, I talk about the idea that fairy spirits, the fae, supernatural beings that are not human do not have words for good and evil in their languages. These are specifically human constructs. And fairy spirits do not have the same kind of morality that particularly Western-minded human beings do. Now, that is not to say that fairy spirits are innately evil. They are both malevolent and benevolent simultaneously. And if you think about it, that's not very different from human beings either. Every human being, ourselves, every one of us, has the potential to do good and also has the potential to cause harm. I think that particularly in the Western world, human morality has gotten very tied to these concepts of good and evil. What is right versus what is wrong, what causes harm as opposed to what causes healing. That is where human beings seem to focus their morality on. But for me, morality is looking at every situation and attempting to do the right thing in the right moment. And that actually can be a very difficult thing to do because what is right in the moment may have harmful consequences in the future. And so morality is a very difficult concept to navigate. In order to be the best versions of ourselves and to do our best in the present moment is to consider what is valuable, not just to ourselves, but for the betterment of all. And that's where morality expands beyond good and evil, is having a set of values that helps you choose to do what is right. Now, fairy spirits are large and vast. There are many different types and species. So I'm sure that each individual species has important values to them. And in addition to that, individual fairies, just like human beings, have values that they personally subscribe to. So when I bring to you these 7 different concepts that I'm going to talk about today, these are values that I personally have encountered working with the fairy spirits in my own personal practice, and values that I think are consistent through the research that I've conducted over the years. But do keep in mind that this isn't set in stone, this isn't a law, this is based on my personal experience. I also find that these values can be found throughout folklore stories and also can be found in fairy tales. So I would like to use some of my favorite fairy tales to articulate the 7 values that I have come up with to share with you today. The first core values of the fairy spirits I believe to be respect. With fairy spirits, it has been my experience that they see human beings not necessarily on par with them, but human beings are on par with all living life on the planet Earth. So a human being has the same value as a forest rabbit. One is not above the other. A rabbit's life is just as important as a human's life, and in a fairy's mind, the rabbit's life is just as important as the fairy spirit's life. And it is respect for that balance that each life is important and has something to give and is just as special and as unique and as valuable as the other, you find this concept running throughout historical folklore and in our fairy tales. And one of my favorite fairy tales that I think articulates this concept very well is one that has the name Three Dwarves in the Woods. Now, in this beautiful tale, a young girl is living with her stepmother and her stepsister. And unlike her stepsister, she's been given beautiful aesthetic gifts. She has a lovely voice, she has a fair face, whereas the stepsister is not as aesthetically pleasing as this young girl. And so both the mother and the stepsister become extremely jealous of the girl and are trying to get rid of her. So in this story, the stepmother dresses the poor little child in a paper dress and sends her out into the snow to find strawberries. Now, the idea is that this girl may not love her stepmother, but she respects her position as her mother. And so the little girl does obey her stepmother, and she does go out into the woods to find the strawberries. She encounters in the forest three dwarves who invite her in to sit by the fire. And she is so grateful that she goes in and sits by the fire to warm herself. So when the dwarves ask her to share with her small crust of bread that she's been given to eat, she gladly shares the crust of bread with the dwarves. Then the dwarves ask her to sweep the steps for them, which she does because she is so grateful that they gave her shelter from the cold. So when the girl returns to her stepmother, she finds these beautiful strawberries and is able to fulfill the task that the stepmother gave her. And because of the respect that she gave to the dwarves, not arguing, and respecting her stepmother's authority, the dwarves give her the gift is that when she speaks, gold will fall from her mouth. So when the stepmother asks the little girl where she found the strawberries in the snow, the girl starts to explain about the dwarves, and as she does, the room fills with gold as the little girl talks. Because of this, the stepmother then thinks that her own daughter, her flesh and blood daughter, will be able to receive gifts from these dwarves as well. But instead of being invited into the house, she marches right in and sits by the fire without even asking. She opens up her picnic lunch and starts to eat her lunch and swats the dwarves' hands away and says that they are not allowed to touch any of her food because she only has enough for herself and won't be able to share. The dwarves, however, don't want to give up on her just yet, so they ask the stepsister if she will sweep their steps for them, and she says that she is not their servant and won't do it, and leaves the house in a huff and goes back home. So when her mother confronts her and asks her what she brought back from the dwarves' cottage, the little girl opens her mouth and proceeds to tell how horrible the dwarves were to her, and out jumps a frog from her lips, and she tries to keep telling her story, and the more she talks, the more frogs jump out of her mouth. So finally her mother says to her, "Stop talking and go to your room, or the whole house will be filled with these vile little things." And the idea behind the story, of course, is that respect, when it's given, is valuable and usually rewarded. And when someone is disrespectful, there are consequences to those actions as well. The second value that I've encountered working with the fairy spirits is truth. Fairy spirits are very keen to the truth because to lie is to show weakness. When you are coming from a position of strength, there is no need to lie. So a person who lies is coming from a position of weakness. And remember, with respect, fairy spirits want equality and balance and value. So they do not want someone coming towards them from a position of weakness. They want to face each individual on equal terms. And a story that I think fits this particular concept is The Emperor's New Clothes. Now, in some versions of The Emperor's New Clothes, it is two travelers that come to see the emperor and are tailors to make him these magical clothes. But in some versions of the story, these tailors are not humans, but mischievous fairy spirits. Either way, it is a fairy tale nonetheless. And in this particular story, there is an emperor who is very flamboyant and absolutely adores clothing and fashion and making a spectacle of himself. And these mischievous tailors take it upon themselves to tell the emperor that they will design the most beautiful clothes that he has ever seen, and that in addition to them being superior in quality, they will also have magical properties, in that the only people that will be able to see the beauty of his new clothing are those that are of superior minds. If they do not see the cloth that the clothes are made from, then that means that they are a simpleton. And of course, the tailors are making absolutely nothing. There is no cloth to be seen. But of course, when the emperor comes in to inspect the clothes, he marvels at how beautiful it is. He brings in his advisors, and they too remark on how beautiful it is. And of course, the emperor parades in front of all of his citizens so that he may know which of his citizens are of superior mind and which of those are the simpletons. And most of the citizens, of course, go along with everyone else and say that the clothes are remarkable, except for one small child that says that the emperor is not wearing any clothes at all. And so innocence becomes the voice of reason, and that is the moral of the story. And The Emperor's New Clothes articulates very clearly the idea of coming from a position of weakness when you are lying. The emperor was the biggest liar of all. He was the one who donned the clothes and paraded in front of his citizens naked as a jaybird. The third value that I've encountered working with the fairy spirits is gratitude. A fairy spirit doesn't necessarily require a one-to-one exchange in all of their interactions with other beings. And fairy spirits have been known to provide exceptionally magical gifts in exchange for simple kindness. Another one of my personal favorite fairy stories that shows the concept of gratitude is the story of Beauty and the Beast. Let's just put aside the Stockholm Syndrome. Let's just put it aside for a second and let's talk about gratitude. Now, Disney actually did do a pretty good job of adapting the original fairy story. I do have a resource link down for you below to a very close rendition of the original Beauty and the Beast fairy story, so I would highly recommend that you check that link out. But in the original Beauty and the Beast story, Beauty is not a single child. She actually has two sisters and some brothers. And in comparison, especially to her two sisters, Beauty is just so exceptionally grateful for everything that her father does for her. She's just grateful for the presence of her father. Beauty's father is a merchant who has great wealth, which Beauty is grateful for, but then he loses his wealth, and Beauty is the only one that adjusts her perception and is just simply grateful for the presence of her own father. But then the story turns again, and there is a potential that the father has regained his fortune, and he leaves his family to see if one of his merchant ships has returned and that the goods can be then sold. But when he goes to collect his goods, he is put in debtor's prison, and he has all of these problems, and then he's cast out again, and he's lost in the woods trying to get back to his family, and encounters the castle in the woods. And there he is given a beautiful feast. He's given a clean bed and beautiful clothes to wear. And the father expresses his gratitude for these things that he's been given. But before he leaves the castle, he sees a rose bush growing in the castle garden. And because Beauty had only wanted perhaps a rose from her father's return trip, that he goes and plucks the roses from the bush. And of course, this is what causes the beast to be upset, because he was taking the roses. He wasn't giving in exchange for the roses. Here he had been given all of these things, and they were given gladly, and the father had expressed his gratitude, but there was no gratitude in taking the flowers. But when the beast hears why he wanted the flowers, because they are for his grateful daughter who had requested flowers rather than ribbons and dresses and money, so the father is given the opportunity to return home to say goodbye to his family for the sake of his daughter. Beauty, though, of course, takes the place of her father and goes back to the castle in her father's stead. And once again, all of her needs are met. She is given all of these fine gifts and is once again exceptionally grateful to the beast for sharing all of these things with her. So when she makes a request to see her family, the beast relents and says, of course you can go and see your family, but if you stay more than a week, I will perish without you. She promises to return, but she is delayed. And in the original story, which is much less about Stockholm Syndrome and more about gratitude, is that Beauty appreciates the beast so much and has such gratitude for his presence that she agrees to marry him. And it is that gratitude that transforms the beast into the handsome prince, and therefore they live happily ever after. So fairy spirits are about gratitude. If they want to give you a magical gift, it's not that you have to give them something of equal value in return. You just have to express true gratitude. Now, I keep reminding people that fairy spirits are neither good nor evil. They are both and neither at the same time, a lot like human beings too. But what is a value that is important to fairy spirits is the concept of integrity. Now, integrity is often used interchangeably with honesty, but I think integrity is a little bit different than honesty. While truth is important to a fairy spirit, they may not always disclose all of the truth. And fairy spirits approve when truth is used in clever ways. So a fairy spirit isn't exactly honest, even though they value truth. What I mean by integrity is the concept of follow through. If you make an oath, if you make a vow, if you make a promise, if you say you're going to do something, a fairy spirit in particular expects you to keep your word. And I think a beautiful story that articulates this concept well is the story of the Frog Prince. In this story, a young princess is playing outside near the lake, and she loses her ball and it sinks to the bottom of the lake. And a frog jumps up and says, I can get that ball for you. What will you give me in exchange? And she says, I don't know, what do you want? And the frog says that he wants to eat from her plate, drink from her cup, and sleep on her pillow for at least 3 days. So she agrees to this. She makes this bargain with the frog, and so the frog dives into the lake and retrieves her beautiful ball and gives it to her. And of course, the fairy princess grabs the ball and runs to the castle and slams the door in the frog's face. But of course, the frog comes to the castle, and her father, king, makes the little princess hold herself to her word. And in fact, the frog prince does eat from the princess's plate, he does drink from her cup, and he does sleep on her pillow for 3 days. And of course, at the end of the story, the frog turns into a handsome prince, showing that keeping one's promises leads to success and happiness. The fifth value, wit. Wit can be knowledgeable, but it's not quite knowledge. Not all fairy spirits are interested in the pursuit of knowledge, but they do appreciate cleverness. And in no story is this better articulated than in the story of Puss in Boots, one of my personal favorites of the fairy tale genre, because I'm quite fond of cats in addition to bunnies. The third miller's son, who is bequeathed Puss the cat, while his brothers get the farm and the mill. And so Puss says, no, it's going to be all right. I'm going to make your fortune. And he says, grab me some boots and I'm going to turn your life around. The first thing that Puss does is he starts collecting rabbits and birds and fish and all kinds of things that he's caught with his great hunting skills, and he takes them and gives them to the neighboring king as gifts and says, oh, my lord the Marquis has given you these gifts. So then when the king is traversing through the land, he convinces his master to take off all of his clothes and jump in the river. And he's like, and the miller's son doesn't want to do this. He thinks he's crazy. He's like, no, I don't want to do that. He said, no, you got to trust me. Just jump in the river. So then Puss runs up to the carriage of the king and he says, oh my goodness, my master, the Marquis, he's drowning in the river. You have to save him. And because the king has received all these gifts from this talking cat in boots, he's like, oh yes, you must save the Marquis. And so they take the miller's son out of the water and they dress him in all these fine clothes. And then the king introduces the miller's son, who is exceptionally handsome because he's not been interbred, to his beautiful daughter. And she, of course, instantly falls in love with this handsome young man. So on their travels, while the king is entertaining the Marquis, Puss goes to the castle of the ogre. And in this story, the fairy creature is the one that doesn't possess the wit, but keep following. It's still important to fairy creatures. So, of course, the ogre is a shape-shifting beast, and Puss uses his wit. He says, oh my goodness, yes, you are quite terrifying, because the ogre, of course, transforms into a huge lion. He says, oh yes, that's very terrifying, but it's one thing to turn into something big and scary, but I don't know, I'm not going to be impressed unless I can see range. Surely you can't possibly turn into something small like a mouse. That's just not possible. The only thing you can do is like big and scary, and you're a one-trick pony and that's it. And the ogre's like, no, I can do that too. And so the ogre turns himself into a mouse. And of course, Puss, being the cat, pounces on the mouse and eats him. Love that. Love that. So good. And then, of course, Puss takes the king and his beautiful daughter to the Marquis's huge castle that was formerly the ogre's, and the miller's son lives happily ever after thanks to the wit of his cat. The sixth value that I have encountered working with the fairy spirits is perseverance. This needs to be considered very carefully through a human lens, because with perseverance, humans tend to think, oh, I have to keep going, I have to keep going, I have to keep going, no matter what. But the difference between just pushing through and keeping going and perseverance is one thing. There has to be an end game, there has to be a focus, there has to be a purpose behind it, because some things are worth giving up on. They are. But what I mean by perseverance is having a very specific goal and understanding that pursuing that goal may have hardships and may induce some suffering, but that you know exactly what you want and you're heading towards that and persevering through it. And I think a story that I really think articulates this concept is The Wild Swans. In the story of the Wild Swans, there are 12 children, 11 sons and 1 daughter. And an evil queen curses the children of her husband and turns the 11 sons into swans, and then sends the daughter away from the kingdom. And then, of course, the father becomes heartbroken and starts to wither away. So the young princess is desperate to find her brothers, and does, in fact, find her brothers. They have the ability to turn back into their human forms only at nighttime. So they can only converse with her and talk to her during the night. So they find a way to return them permanently to human form. And how she has to do that is the princess has to pick stinging nettles and weave the nettles into shirts for each of her 11 brothers. And while she does this, she is forbidden to speak until all 11 shirts are completed and on each of the 11 boys. And in this, she counters many hardships because the stinging nettles, of course, make her hands bleed. And being unable to speak, she's actually taken in by a handsome king who's like, well, I'm going to marry you. And she has no way to say that she can't. But then when they see her sneaking off into the graveyard to collect the nettles, they think she's a witch and they throw her in jail and they're going to cut off her head and all these things. And the king is trying to tell her, if only you'll speak and tell us why you are in the graveyard and making these shirts, then we'll know what's going on. And she refuses to talk because she knows what her task is, and she is willing to persevere to the end of her goal. So perseverance is not about just keeping going and keeping going and keeping going. It's about knowing precisely what you want and being willing to get there. And the happy part of the story is, of course, at the very last minute when she's been taken off to be burned at the stake or beheaded or whatever it is, she finishes the last of the shirts, throws them onto each of the 11 swans, and they turn back into her brothers, and she and her brothers and her king husband live happily ever after. The final principle when it comes to working with fairy spirits is going to be a hard one to accept. And something that fairy spirits value and prize very, very highly is the concept of pleasure. And that is something that we, in especially the Western human world, really deny. We see pleasure as something to be discarded and not as a moral and ethical value. That is not the case with fairy spirits. There are numerous historical folklore tales of fairy spirits kidnapping musicians and children and nursemaids and companions simply because they enjoy that person's company. That's it. That's the only reason that they take these people. They will break out into dance and they will spontaneously start singing. These are the stories that we have with fairy spirits. They are driven by pleasure. It is not something that they see as morally corrupt. They see pleasure as an integral part of their society. Pleasure is what helps them choose the right course of action at the right moment in time. A story that I think articulates this is called Prince Kamar and Princess Budir. And in this story, two elves find two beautiful human beings on different ends of the world from each other. And these two elves decide that these two beautiful humans, the most beautiful humans that they have ever encountered, should get together and marry and make beautiful babies. That's what they decide. For the sheer joy of it, simply because these two human beings bring them so much joy just looking at them. But they need more fun than that. They need more fun. So they bring the two people together for one night only. And of course, they fall desperately in love and they exchange rings with one another and promise to marry only that person. And then, of course, the elves take them back to their respective places in the world. And these two poor humans are so desperate for each other that they are sick with their love for one another. And they will marry no one else. And everyone is trying to convince them that their love is simply a dream, but they have the proof in their rings. The Princess Budir has a brother who searches to the ends of the earth for Prince Kamar. And through all of his toils and trials and perseverance, the brother does in fact find the prince, and they bring them together and they marry, and they do in fact please the two little elves that caused all this mischief, and they live happily ever after and have many remarkable and beautiful human babies. And I think that human beings actually could benefit from their teachings on that. Is that maybe we need to listen to that voice that tells us this doesn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, maybe it doesn't feel right. And maybe it's not the right course of action. So I think that we could learn a lot from the fairies and in their pursuit of pleasure, and we should put more of that into our lives.
So many people are fearful of fairy spirits because they don't have the same ideologies that the Western world has, and has that dichotomy of this is good and this is evil. And so many people are afraid of them, and definitely in ancient times it was very common to have protections against fairy creatures. But I honestly think that the greatest protection that we could ever have, if you truly are afraid, if you encounter a fairy spirit, the best protection that you could ever do is get them to laugh. If you can bring to them and to yourself a moment of pleasure, the likeliness that they will forgive any transgression that you've given them is very, very high.
because pleasure is such an important value, and one I really think should be of higher importance in the human world as well. So what did you think of these values? Is there something on this list that you completely disagree with, or is there a value that you would like to see exchanged? I would really be curious to know, and I hope that you will share your comments with me down below. If you liked this video, I think that you would also enjoy Fairies Keep Out, Protections from the Fairies, which is my video commentary discussing the most prevalent wards and guards against the fairies. Part of the focus here on Fairy Fortunes is to discuss my personal take on modern fairy faith spirituality, and if you're interested in that topic, I invite for you to follow me on Facebook and Instagram. I offer unique content on both of those platforms and talk a great deal about my personal practice there. And in addition to that, I am also a professional fortune teller. And on my website, you can purchase very low-cost readings via email, but also on the website is my blog where I talk more about these concepts on fairy folklore, fairy faith spirituality, and also I post a great many fairy-themed events there as well. So I do hope that you will check me out there. And with that, have a magical day.